This is A New Angle, a show about cool people doing awesome things in and around Montana. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today, I decided to phone a friend and ask University of Montana law professor and A New Angle's resident legal expert, Cowie, to help us navigate the early days of President Trump's second term. And given some of the questions at hand, we are also joined by professor of constitutional law, Constance. We'll try to separate signal from noise and help bring clarity to this dizzying time. Craig, Constance, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us, Justin.
Craig's been on the show a bunch of times, but Constance, you are new to listeners, so tell us, where did you grow up and what did your parents do?
I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
Okay.
My dad is a Lutheran pastor. My mom was a stay-at-home mom who went back to school and got a degree in accounting when I was in high school.
Very good. And briefly, how did you make your way to the University of Montana?
My husband is a smoke jumper, so his job brought us to Missoula in the first place.
Sure. And now you're teaching the constitutional law classes at the law school?
Yes, state and federal constitutional law.
Getting right into it, what is happening? What are lawyers paying attention to in the early days of the second Trump administration?
What we're looking at right now is really big questions about what government is and how it operates. And these are being teed up by a flurry of executive actions taken by the new Trump administration. If you try to kind of characterize what these actions are, I think there's a few really significant buckets to look at.
Okay.
So those would be, one, what is the executive branch's ability to not spend money that Congress appropriates to the executive branch? Does that give the president the ability to stop funding programs that Congress has created through legislation? Related to that is the question of whether and how the president can effectively get rid of executive agencies. So These are agencies that are generally created by Congress, but that the president has supervisory authority over. And then, again, related to that is the president's ability to fire people within those agencies, depending on what level they are at within the agency.
Okay. Maybe we start with the agencies. Craig, I know this is sort of your area of expertise and practice and teaching, particularly the CFPB. Maybe start there.
The way this is playing out is that the government will put in a new person in charge. That person immediately issues basically a complete work stoppage order, and then they start firing people. So the administration has indicated that it's going to fire all the employees or virtually all the employees of the USAID. There was reporting last night that people were expecting the vast majority of employees at the CFPB, so that's somewhere around 1,500 people, to be fired. Veterans Administration fired 1,000 people yesterday. Forestry Service is set to fire 3,000 today. These are primarily probationary and or what we call term employees. So they're hired for a specific amount of time, like a year or 2 years.
Okay.
Basically, for the last 150 years, we've had in America a system where we prohibit administrations from firing federal employees based on their whims, right? They have to fire them for cause. If Congress does not appropriate, as Constance was mentioning, if Congress doesn't appropriate enough money for an agency to fund all of its current employees, it'll have to go through what's called a reduction in force, which means some people will be let go. That's not a cause, like they haven't done anything wrong.
Sure.
It's just that the agency doesn't have enough money and they can't afford to pay them anymore. So these are not any of that. The probationary employees who've been fired, and this has been reported heavily, and I know what happened at the CFPB, got a form letter that didn't even have it just had blanks for your names and nothing was filled in. And it just says you don't fit with our needs. And so you're let go. Probationary employees, and that's usually anywhere up to 2 years in the federal government, your first 2 years, they don't have the same protection. So it is easier to let them go. But once you get past that point, then theoretically you should only be fired for cause or because the appropriations hasn't come through and you need to reduce that. So when there's a threat to lay off, the entire workforce of an agency, that is not normal. In fact, we've never seen anything like it.
So when you say not normal, does that mean illegal?
I think it's pretty clearly illegal, at least as the law exists today.
Okay.
Constance may disagree with me, but in my view, the executive does not have the power to simply shut down and fire an entire agency of people when Congress has created that agency. And when Congress creates an agency, actually mandates that it do certain things, none of which can happen when people get fired.
So maybe this is time to bring Constance in and give us a little sort of 101 on separation of powers and what Congress does, what the president does, and probably get to the courts at some point in this conversation.
Yeah, so using the terminology of the founders, Congress has the power of the purse, the president has the power of the sword, the court has the power of the pen. So Congress does its work by spending. It's Congress's ability to pass laws, fund programs that allows it to really execute its will. The president kind of takes the baton from Congress, and the president has both the power and the duty to faithfully execute the laws that Congress has passed. Now, what is happening right now is really kind of sharpening what faithful execution means.
Okay.
There are certainly instances where what the president is doing is in direct conflict with the express will of Congress. An example of that would be the funding freeze. President Trump issued an executive order, said we're going to reconsider funding to make sure that we aren't doing any DEI programming.
Okay.
That was used to implement a really broad funding freeze to stop the flow of money. This action is definitely in direct conflict with the Impoundments Control Act, which is a law that Congress passed. Now, the president's argument with that seems to be that the Impoundment Control Act is in fact unconstitutional because it interferes too directly with the president's core zone of executive power.
Is that Impoundment Act from the Nixon administration when he defied Congress and some legislation was passed to sort of change that system or clarify it?
Yes, I think it went into effect in 1974.
Okay. And what was going on then? Is that an historical analog or is that a different thing?
So I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that President Nixon very famously said it can't be illegal if the president does it.
Yeah.
And President Trump and his vice president have both basically said the same thing. So in that sense, they are drawing from that. But President Nixon didn't try to sort of completely obstruct what Congress was intending in the sense of like shutting down an entire agency. So there's some nuance here. The executive has a huge amount of what we call prosecutorial discretion. In other words, they get to pick the cases they bring, the things they investigate, their priorities, and that's all appropriate and within our system, even within the guidelines given to the executive by Congress.
Just to press on this a little bit, so President Obama said, I'm not going to prosecute recreational use of cannabis, even though it was a federal crime, according to Congress. Is that a similar type of case of defying the will of Congress, or is this materially different in some way?
I think it's definitely different in scope. There is a difference between making priorities when you have a limited amount of money to spend versus turning off the spigot altogether. And so there is something that is different there. The argument that the Trump administration is making, or is very likely to make, is that because there's clearly some inherent discretion to make those priorities, it's not really the role of the court to come in and to say, here's exactly where the line is.
Okay. What Constance just said is exactly right. Where I might alter the focus a little bit is that this is the scale, and certain of the actions are, I believe, different in kind and I believe unprecedented. I think it's fair to say that every administration has, on specific issues, tussled with Congress and with the courts about exactly where the executive power can lawfully go.
And that's by design, right?
That is by design. But I am not aware of anything rivaling a move to shut down at least 3 current agencies completely. So just today there was reporting about money that was supposed to come to Montana for certain forestry work that is now on hold and they don't know what's happening. And there are many states where they get a huge amount of assistance, or they work cooperatively with the federal government to achieve both the goals of the state and the federal government. And all of that money has dried up, along with medical trials being cut off in the middle. This stuff is changing by the day. And it is so hard to keep track.
And that's part of the explicit strategy, it would seem, is to move really quickly.
Yeah. Some academics have sort of referred to this as a blitzkrieg, sort of an all-out assault on many different fronts in an effort to make it hard to combat any individual change. That being said, there is an enormous amount of resistance popping up, both in the courts and in the press as well. So none of this is going uncontested, but it is quite a lot, and it has real impacts on people. The courts are a long-term avenue, perhaps, but the courts don't generally move quickly. And so a lot of these things are happening, and you're not going to know the effects immediately unless you really understand the levers in which the way the federal government operates and the way it interacts with the states. And most people just don't know that. There's no reason they should. But it's a pretty complicated operation and with a lot of dependencies. And the thing about all of this is sort of a move fast and break things. And that could be fine if you're developing an app for taxi services. It's less fine if you're talking about somebody's health insurance payments or their Social Security, or whether or not they're going to get their money back from some company that scammed them.
We'll be back to my conversation with Craig Cowie and Constance Vankley after this short break. A New Angle is proudly presented by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. This show does not happen without these pillars of our community, and I'm so grateful for their support and encouragement. And speaking of support, have you checked out our new website yet? anewanglepodcast.com. There you can support our show directly with a variety of subscription options. Subscribers get access to bonus episodes, additional segments, writings, and other benefits. So check it out at anewanglepodcast.com.
Hi, this is Steve Albini, and you're listening to A New Angle.
Welcome back to New Angle. I'm speaking with the University of Montana law professors Craig Cowie and Constance Vankley about the early days of the second Trump administration. Maybe let's take an issue like USAID. First of all, Constance, I'll have you walk us through what USAID is. And there's been an order to stop these payments, these foreign aid payments, and court action to reinstate those payments, etc. But let's step through that case and how it's unfolding.
USAID is an agency that was initially created by executive order by President Kennedy. However, it later became through a congressional act. So if you were looking at an agency that came about exclusively by executive order. Generally, what happens by executive order can be undone by executive order.
Yeah.
But that's not the case with USAID, because you have Congress later passing a law that establishes an agency that already had been established by executive order, and then you have the funding continually going to USAID.
So it was started by executive action, but then Congress sort of validated that,
Yes.
and then it becomes a thing that can't be undone by executive action.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And USAID is sort of the government's soft skills arm in other nations, particularly developing nations. It sends people and resources to other nations to kind of foster a diplomacy, a goodwill view of the United States. It's generally enjoyed bipartisan support and has existed within government for over 50 years.
A lot of what USAID is deliver American agricultural products to other countries is in the form of aid. But so it's a real support for farmers and ranchers here in the U.S. because that's where they'll buy the stuff from them, use it to deliver it, and then use it to advance America's foreign policy goals.
Mm-hmm. So the president says we're going to stop all these payments and all these shipments or whatever we're sending out through USAID, and then what legal action gets taken?
So a lawsuit is filed challenging what is effectively a shutdown of USAID, not just the payment, but the agency itself.
USAID, I believe, most of the employees were put on administrative leave. So that's already arguably an adverse employment action. Then if there was a move to make mass layoffs, that's been stayed by the court.
And so when a stay happens or when a court orders that payments continue, have those payments continued, or like are those employees still in their jobs? What's happening as this thing is moving through some court system?
An image that I think is kind of helpful to think about this, because there's a lot of concern that you hear and that you'll see media coverage of about whether or not the administration is complying with court orders. Yes. Former Attorney General Jeff Sessions described compliance with court order in these major cases as trying to turn a battleship 180 degrees. And so you do expect that it may take some time just as it's taken time for agencies to implement and respond to the executive orders, it takes some time to turn that battleship around and come into compliance with the court orders. Thus far, I don't think that there's been anything that willful and sustained noncompliance with a court order. I think that there are public statements that raise the question about whether that will happen later as a political matter. But as of right now, the government does appear to be showing up in court and coming into compliance with court orders, including in this case.
I mean, we hear the term constitutional crisis thrown around. It would seem like one instance of what you might argue is a constitutional crisis is when the president directly defies an order by a court. Is that reasonable? And have we seen that yet?
That is what we call the easy case. That is overwhelmingly from both the right and the left. The major concern you hear is that there will be a situation where there is willful disobedience. One court has already found that the grants that the judge ordered to be restarted had not been restarted. Now, my understanding is that the judge hasn't taken any sort of sanctions kind of motion. So it could be the situation that it's a good faith, but it could also be something else. I think that we'll see if that plays out. The order on the grants vis-a-vis USAID, I think, just issued yesterday. So my guess is that that's not going to happen very quickly. Also, because people are being put on administrative leave, which means they can't work, or being ordered not to work, or being fired, including in the places that turn the money back on. So that's also going to be increasingly difficult. Some people, some very respected scholars have said we're already in the constitutional crisis because the level of outright defiance of Congress's dictates doesn't appear to be justified by law under any arguments. Because even if the Impoundment Control Act isn't constitutional itself, I think it's one thing to say it in a very isolated instance like we were talking about before, which there have been these in every administration, versus a situation where you're whole-scale shutting down agencies. And so it's not just like a simple prosecutorial discretion, but you're actually taking all of the congressionally mandated things offline.
So I think when you think about that big question of, is this a constitutional crisis? Is there going to be a constitutional crisis?
Right.
How will we be able to know it when we see it? We are seeing an unprecedented disrespect or noncompliance with constitutional norms. It's a different pace and it's a different scale than we've seen before. And I think that's accurate. Whether or not that becomes a constitutional crisis is a different question, because on the other side of the debate, you hear people saying our Constitution is designed so that each branch of government is going to be ambitious of its power. And while it is true that the executive action here is different in timing, in scale than it has been before, a constitutional crisis would occur if and only if there was that willful and sustained violation of a direct court order binding the parties in that particular case.
And where's Congress in all of this? Just sort of descriptively, Congress has been absent. We haven't heard much from them at all. Do they play a role? I mean, they appropriated funds, and if those funds aren't being spent as appropriated, that's a thing. But like, what role does Congress have once there's that conflict?
Congress, like the judiciary, is a co-equal branch of government that has the ability to check government power. And it's because of that power that Congress has that the president's assertion of a unilateral impoundment power, unilateral power to not spend money appropriated by Congress, would potentially mean that Congress is not, in fact, a co-equal branch that can check the president's power, right? But Congress does have the ability to pass laws. Those are the avenues through which Congress can disagree with maybe a particular policy put into effect by the president by passing a law. Congress can refuse to confirm nominees for appointment to high-level policymaking positions. They haven't
we haven't
really
seen any
done
evidence
that.
of this.
Yeah, we have not seen that. And then finally, and this is a much higher bar, Congress has the power of impeachment.
Sure.
Just to give a specific example, so in 1980, Congress didn't like what the Federal Trade Commission had done, and they zeroed out their budget. And so that changed the position pretty quickly as far as how the FTC was going to proceed.
And was that the way it should work?
Yeah,
if you were going to halt funding for an agency, is that the way it sort of
up? Congress has so it's interesting because Congress, the executive can write rules and do some other things, but when Congress doesn't like them, there's an actual mechanism for Congress to just disavow them and shut them. They don't even have to pass a new law. They have to go through the Congressional Review Act, and they can just say, no, that's not what we meant. Or they can always pass new laws to arrange things. I think one thing is that everything that's happening could happen lawfully if it was done differently. Congress could and has decide that it does not want an agency to exist. In fact, in 2010, in the Dodd-Frank Act, when it created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, it uncreated the Office of Thrift Supervision.
Sure.
And in so doing, there were many, many provisions and a whole lot of thought given to, okay, if we're going to dismantle an agency, where do the powers that agency hold, where do they go? Do we want them not to be powers anymore? Do we want to just not have the federal government do that? Do we want other agencies to do it, other parts of the executive? What happens to those employees? Are they all just fired? Are we going to give them sort of advantageous transfer rights so that they can find other jobs in the government? And the way I like to think about it is it is a glide path, none of which is happening now, right? Because things are happening very fast. In fact, when the CFPB was ordered to stop working, so the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, so it does a lot of different things. But one thing that happened very quickly was federal law requires that mortgages comply with certain laws. And if you're a lender and you don't comply with those laws, you can be sued. You can be sued by an attorney general. You can be sued by a consumer. You can be sued by the federal government. Mm-hmm. Lending is very important and it's very complicated. So we've created what we call a safe harbor, which means if you offer a loan that meets sort of these basic conditions, then you are immune from suit. So as a lender, you've eliminated one form of risk. And of course, businesses, banks included, always are about minimizing the risk or at least understanding their risks so they can properly plan. So one of the terms that the qualified mortgage hinges on is an interest rate that is set by the CFPB every single week. It is calculated and put out there. And when the shutdown happened, academics started reporting about, well, what about this interest rate? This interest rate, and in a downward directed interest climate, so where interest rates are dropping, it's not a big deal. But if interest rates were to tick up, which they did this week, what would happen is mortgages would start to fall out of that safe harbor because the actual rate that people were offering mortgage, the market rate, would be beyond the margin of error for that rate because that rate wasn't being reset.
Right. So if I'm a bank, I have to keep my rates at market prices in order to sort of protect myself and be competitive. I'm originating a loan at a higher rate than what the safe harbor would indicate because the CFPB, which isn't doing its work, hasn't updated the rate.
That's right. And maybe
I am exposed to risk as that lender.
Right. It seems very clear to me that when the acting director, Russell Vaughn, shut down the CFPB, he had no idea about that function. So they're not making a big deal about it publicly. But all of a sudden, the people who set that rate, they got ordered to do their job again. So they got directed to come back and do it. And there's a bunch of stuff like that. The CFPB issues a whole series of threshold rates that they adjust for inflation every year. In fact, we just went through a series of them in January. Not changing those rates, not adjusting those rates means it's funny. These efforts are designed to be deregulatory, but they result in more regulation, right? More risk, more regulation. And what would happen with these things, if they're not adjusted, more and more entities would become covered by them because the thresholds weren't properly being reset to reflect actual rates. And so more companies would be subject to regulation that Congress and the old CFPB, the regulations sort of are set up so that they wouldn't be.
Tune in next week for part 2 of this conversation with University of Montana law professors Craig Cowie and Constance. Thanks for listening to A New Angle. If you like what we do and want to support us directly, please consider a subscription at anewanglepodcast.com. A New Angle is recorded at Studio 49, a generous gift from UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. Our presenting sponsors are First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Keely Larson is our producer. Maddie Jordan is our production assistant. VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music. And Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.